Especially in larger environments, if you're not running 4.1 yet or 5.0 yet, make sure you start upgrading, because you can significantly benefit when you're doing maintenance in the evening, right? This is the difference between being at home at 8 or being at home at 11 in the evening. And I'd rather be at home at 8.
I'd rather be home at 5.
Yeah, but you're a evangelist, a marketing guy, so. Sorry about that. I'm not marketing anymore, so now I can say stuff like that. So networking, Scott already spoke about networking. And the typical thing with networking is you do all of these analyses. What I've seen most out in the field is that the average bandwidth consumption, we're talking about 4 Mbps. It's not more than that, not a lot more than that, except for during the backup times. Because that's when the majority of the I/O happens over the network, depending on the backup solutions that they use. So you might want to take that into consideration. Now, the one thing, though, to keep in mind with network sizing, it is important what kind of services you're offering. Right? If you're offering load balancing services, firewall services, it's the kind of stuff that you need to keep in mind when you're sizing your network as well. Not only from a bandwidth perspective, but for instance, from a physical perspective, how many NICs do you have? Do you have a specific isolated DMZ, for instance? Are customers using VLANs? Are there people actually not using VLANs today in the room? Yay. Actually, last time I asked, there were 5 people raised their hands. They weren't using VLANs out of compliance and regulations that they had locally. So something that is frustrating and makes the environment fairly complex, because when you end up with 12 or 16 NICs, the vSwitch architecture is fairly complex, and it's difficult to manage as well. Now, storage sizing is typically where it gets interesting, because this is also typically from a support perspective where we get probably 90% or 85% of the calls on. If there's an issue, it's around storage. And typically the issue is around storage performance. Although size does matter when you start doing your architecture, performance is also a critical part of it. And there's multiple things that will drive the performance of your environment. For instance, one of those things could be the RAID level used. So as you've seen in the earlier slides, for instance, we were using a NetApp file. Now it's NetApp's best practice to use RAID DP, and there's a specific RAID overhead associated with that. That applies to every type of RAID solution that you have, right? So if it's EMC using RAID 5, or if it's whoever doing RAID 1, there's also always a specific type of overhead associated with it. So as soon as you start doing the math, make sure you know how many reads, writes, and what kind of RAID solution you'll end up using. Because that's going to determine the amount of virtual machines you can have up and running on a single data store. Because if you did the math without knowing, for instance, what the RAID overhead was, and you figured out, hey, I have 42 IOPS on average, I can run 50 virtual machines on that data store from a sizing perspective, and from a read IO perspective, it's, sounds okay. The write IO is actually where the overhead comes in, because every single write needs to be copied to multiple disks, depending on the RAID set or the RAID type you're using. So in that case, when there's one IO, it might actually end up being 4 IOs or 5 IOs, depending on the RAID set that you're using. Now in the end, that's going to determine the performance for a virtual machine. So make sure you figure out, from a sizing and scaling perspective, what the IO pattern is. And one thing I can recommend is make sure you talk to your storage vendor about that, because it's going to differ per storage vendor, and they all have their own best practices, and they all have their own reporting tools, and every single time the outcome will look different. Now the other aspect that's really important in my opinion, and something that a lot of people seem to forget, is disaster recovery, or at least business continuity. So you figured out you can have 50 virtual machines running up on the data store, or 60, or maybe even 100. But what happens when that data store fails? Let's assume VMFS is corrupted. It doesn't happen too often, but it can happen, right? Then what? Well, at some point you need to start restoring virtual machines. So you have an SLA internally which says within 8 hours you need to be able to restore those virtual machines. Well, you had 100 virtual machines up and running on the data store. it's 16 or 32 terabyte, who knows? How long is it going to take you to actually restore those virtual machines? It's probably not going to take you 8 hours, it's probably going to be a lot longer than that. So as soon as you start creating that architecture, make sure you think about your failure scenario as well. So your failure domain, how many virtual machines, or at least from a failure perspective, what can I tolerate? 50 virtual machines might not sound like a lot, but when you have 150 virtual machines, it's 1/3 of your estate which is gone. And I can tell you that your manager is going to be breathing down your neck to make sure you have these up and running as soon as possible. So you might want to take that into account as soon as you start doing your designs. Now the other thing that I wanted to mention is the new storage solutions. Downstairs there's a whole bunch of storage vendors, for instance Nimbus Data is out there. I saw Fusion.io. There's a lot of SSD storage, a lot of hybrid storage out there today. The thing with these solutions is that a lot of people focus on the performance that they can offer, but there's also other advantages that they can offer. For instance, rebuilding a RAID set. Rebuilding a RAID set typically takes a lot of time, for instance on an EMC VNX. Could take a day, who knows? On these systems, it could take an hour. So what happens if a second disk fails when it's rebuilding a RAID set? It might be that your whole, or at least the data store is gone. So the least amount of time needed is, in my opinion, something you should always go for. So if you have the option to look into different or new storage solutions, make sure you start looking into them. So when we're talking about hosts, we're primarily talking about CPUs, memory. We already mentioned that during the sizing. But for instance, does it really matter if you're using AMD versus Intel? I did the math a couple of times, and more or less it ends up being the same. One of them offers more cores, the other offers more gigahertz. But if you look at it overall from a larger perspective, from a larger point of view, the amount of virtual machines that you can have running on a single host is still more or less the same. So what should you be looking at? Well, for instance, one of the things is cost. And I know most of the technical people are not really concerned about cost. But in the end, your management or your director might be, or he probably is. So when you start investigating new servers, make sure you investigate different options. Because AMD, although it's less adopted than Intel, it's still a proven, viable solution if you ask me. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with Intel, by the way. Same goes to solutions like Blade or Rack. How does that change your design? A thing that a lot of people were forgetting, at least when they started out doing blades, is it creates a lot of hotspots in your data center. So when I did my first virtual design, which was for an insurance company I worked for, our management forced us to start using Blade chassis. We didn't know what we were getting into. So we installed all these new Blade chassis, and we had 4 of them, and we used to have, I don't know, 150, 200 physical machines. Now these 4 Blade chassis were in 2 racks. We used to have 6 racks full of servers, right? Now we only had 2 racks. So what happened, from a cooling perspective, the system couldn't handle it. Because the amount of hot air actually being blown out of the Blade chassis and the storage system next to it was a lot more significant than those 1U, 2U, or even 4U servers. So when you start making changes to your design like that, make sure you take that into account. The other thing is, for instance, when you start using ESXi, and hopefully everyone is already using ESXi by now, will you use, for instance, the embedded ESXi? Will I go for USB-based solution, or will I use an SD card or local storage, for instance? So there are some advantages and disadvantages to using these. So for instance, if you have a local disk, you kind of lose the flexibility because you need to install it on local disk. The local disk can't be moved around. Then what? If you look at USB, from a resiliency perspective, at least when you have local disks, you typically end up with 2 disks in the RAID 1 set. If 1 disk fails, your environment will keep on running, right? But with USB, are you still as resilient as you are with local disks? Now, in the case of ESXi, I can tell you that you are. So with ESXi, the hypervisor itself is loaded up into memory. So even if the disk fails, ESXi will keep on running. You'll need to replace it fairly quick because at some point you will want to write some of the configuration down, but at least it won't fail immediately. Now another option, for instance, is boot from SAN. Are people actually doing boot from SAN? Just a couple. So I started doing our boot from SAN in the 3 to 5 days, or 2 to 5 days even. And every single time I did a batch, I ended up with the purple screen of death because it was updating my SCSI driver. And the system actually didn't like that. Now on top of that, we started doing the math, and when we're using fairly expensive SAN storage just for an operating system, and we weren't actually moving around hosts or changing identity of hosts. So what was the real benefit for us? Well, we figured out there wasn't really a benefit. So we changed back to local disks. Now there's another option these days, which is auto-deploy. Are people actively doing auto-deploy? Not many. Okay, that's not a good sign. But I know why. And that's one of the reasons I'm here as well. That's what I wanted to mention. Auto-deploy is a really cool solution if you ask me. Putting ESXi over the network. No local disks. Having everything scripted. But if you look at the solution by itself, there's a lot of dependencies. What if your auto-deploy server fails? What if your Pixie server fails? What if your DHCP server is not available? And if you're running everything virtually, then those dependencies might bite you in the end. So I can tell you that VMware is working on solving a lot of these problems, making sure that the auto-deploy appliance or the solution by itself is highly resilient. But that's going to take some time. So if you're planning on using it, make sure to test it. Make sure that part of the test plans, you actually try to figure out what happens if the auto-deploy server fails or if the Pixie server fails. Because I can tell you, booting up will be fairly difficult when there's no place where you can actually get the boot in from.